much, Hans, for the kind introduction and the possibility to speak here today. I'm seeing that I'm not really like a Wagner expert per se, but as you mentioned, more an expert on the political development in the regions. I will basically focus my policy recommendations against the light of spread of jihadism and growing instability in the region, but seeing that these both developments are ultimately the gateway for Wagner and for Russia to establish themselves, there is a very close link and direction regarding these policy recommendations. Given the time available, I will focus on some of fundamental issues and questions. And I will do that given my specific background from the perspective of the current German and European policy debate. So firstly, I think it is really important to highlight the fact that in the fight against terrorism and the growing influence of external actors such as Wagner, such as Russia, we cannot limit ourselves to the Sahel countries alone, but we really have to think and act more regionally. Because a major mistake of like past approaches in counterterrorism measures was not only a lack of long-term strategy, but only a very strong focus on individual countries such as Mali, such as Niger, without really taking any of the regional context or mechanisms into account. And one of the most severe consequences of this lack of long-term strategy and this lack of regional context has been the spread of jihadist groups and influence zones way past the Sahel into the northern parts of the coastal states of the Gulf of Guinea, where they already start to pose a threat to these countries' stability as well. However, when we talk about regional perspectives and approaches, we must not make the mistake of trying to follow like a one-size-fits-all strategy as easy as it may sound, seeing that the initial situations and also the room for maneuver are quite different depending what country we're looking at. And my specific recommendation against this backdrop would therefore be to really stop to implement ad hoc measures, stop to implement ad hoc activities, as we've basically been doing for the last 10 years, more or less, that also take place outside of an overall strategic framework, but really to just take a step back and really begin with identifying different scopes of actions, identifying our own interests and the interests of Western African nations and actors first, and then see where they actually align and where they create opportunity for outcome-based cooperation. And in order to be able to do that, we have to ask ourselves some difficult questions first, specifically with regard to Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And these questions are basically, where do we draw our red lines when discussing cooperations with regimes that have no democratic legitimacy, that commit human rights violations against their own people? And even more broadly, how can we manage the quite delicate balancing act between our value-based foreign policy approach and a more pragmatic and outcome-orientated approach in the Sahel and in Western Africa? And I believe it is undisputed that our approach must become more pragmatic if we do not want to leave the Sahel and Western Africa to the influence of other players such as Russia. And the case of Niger makes quite a compelling example for this, because right after the coup, there was a definite interest from the new military government for a continued cooperation with the European Union. And they were actually waiting for the opportunity to open a dialogue channel regarding such a continued cooperation. However, we saw that these attempts were actually blocked within the EU structures, so that ultimately Niger's withdrawal of the EU Migration Pact and also its newly increased turn towards Russia must also be seen as a result of this refusal from our side. So yeah, that's just a discussion that we urgently need to have. And these are questions that we must find answers to first, as difficult as it might be, before really further engaging in the Sahel states. But, and I believe this is quite a crucial point, while we are having these discussions and while we are evaluating scopes of actions, we definitely can't afford to lose sight of the threat of jihadist spillover into other Western African nations. And this leads me to my next policy recommendation, as I would like to argue that right now our best course of action is probably focusing on the containment of further spread of instability into Western Africa, into the Gulf of Guinea states, as we currently see windows of opportunity for preventive action here that we have already missed in the Sahel states. and that we should therefore focus on strengthening partnerships with nations such as Cote d'Ivoire, as Togo, as Benin and Ghana, as political stability, democracy and good governments. They're probably our best means right now that we have to contain the influence of jihadist actors and also of Wagner, Russia and actors as such. But in order to do that, we also really have to make sure that we continue to be an attractive and relevant partner for these nations, specifically in our security-based cooperation. And that means we really have to start aligning our offers much more strongly with the interests and needs of the partner countries, as we have to be mindful of the fact that, the growing orientation towards Russia, also other players such as the Gulf states, such as Turkey, etc., is partly a result of the fact that our office, and by our office I mean, Germany, Europe, the West, if you so want, have lost attractiveness and relevance, seeing that we don't meet the need of our African partners, as we often tie our office to conditions that are difficult to comprehend, accept, or implement for African partners. And as our offers also lack efficiency when it comes to the implementation and delivery. This is certainly a lesson that we have learned, for example, from the EUTM in Mali, where training approaches never really succeeded in reflecting the reality of military operations on the ground, as has been pointed out by Malian partners many, many times throughout the years. So just as we discuss, rules of engagement with certain actors in an open and honest fashion, we also need to talk about our own shortcomings and the misalignments of our approaches in the last years in order to be able to make more adequate and more helpful offers to our African partners in the future. And that is also very strongly connected to the way that we present ourselves in the region, to the way that we communicate to and with our African partners. The aspect of disinformation was already mentioned earlier. And against this backdrop, I think it is very crucial that we really start targeted communication outreaches to really counter that disinformation narrative, and to point out that Russia's engagement in the region is definitely based on own interest. It's actually quite ironic in a sense, if you so want, that Russia is pushing this narrative of, the West remains to stay a colonial actor in the region, while Russia is basically doing exactly that. I mean, they are isolating regimes. They do elite capture and they extract natural resources. So this is a quite colonial approach, if you so want. And that is something that we should definitely point out more strongly to Western African partners. And that's just something where we are also in charge of shaping communication and shaping the way we present ourselves to Western African partners. And lastly, I would just like to point out one more thing, which is quite essential. However, we should, of course, not overly focus on security-based cooperation only, but should also put an emphasis on addressing the root causes of instability and the spread of jihadism by addressing the local level, by including local actors more strongly and strengthening governance structures on this level. And this could also be particularly relevant in context of the question that was raised earlier, namely which players can we and want to engage with in the future and how. So if cooperation with national governments is no longer possible or is no longer desired due to a lack of democratic legitimization, then a stronger focus on such actors, for example, traditional authorities, could be one possible approach to work around that. So specific measures that we could strengthen, that we could support is, for example, mediation efforts in land use conflicts by local authorities, reintegration programs for former IS recruits in their respective communities, or also direct dialogue tracks with particularly marginalized groups in order to address their grievances more efficiently. And that is definitely something where I could see Western international actors just, take a stronger engagement in. And before I wrap it up, I would just like to also point out on, the German-European discussion side, it is very important to keep pointing out why what is happening in Western Africa is important for us in the first place, to point out the very close ties between what is happening in the Sahel states and what is happening in Europe. I just read the other days that in the last 2 years, Russia extracted, I think it was 2.5 billion US dollars of resources from Western Africa. And there is strong indications that this money is also obviously being used to wage the war in Ukraine. So this is just something that we continuously need to point out in order to make clear why we have to continuously engage ourselves in the region. Thank you very much.